Hello, co-journeyers, and welcome back to The Truth So Help Me Good. I am your host, Barbara Landry, and together we continue to explore some of the bigger questions about this journey we call life. My special guest, Nancy Shear, has a remarkable background, which includes 20 years as an orchestra librarian for the Philadelphia Orchestra and Curtis Institute, and privately for Leopold Stokowski, among others. Her articles have appeared in major outlets, and she has written a book called The Three Tenors. Nancy has lectured for the New York Philharmonic, Philadelphia Orchestra, and Caramore Festival, hosted broadcasts of the New York Philharmonic, New Jersey Symphony, Frick Collection, and Naumburg Foundation, had her own interview programs on WNYC, and served as commentator for the American Public Media. She is taught at New York University's School of Continuing Education, the Lillian Vernon Center for International Affairs at New York University, the New School, and has lectured at the Juilliard School, Manhattan School, and Mann's School of Music, the New School. Nancy has also lectured on the life and work of Eleanor Roosevelt. She is here to speak to us today about her memoir, I Knew a Man Who Knew Brahms. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate so much being with you today.
Oh, so happy to have you here. And to say that you are accomplished is an understatement. What an incredible career and life you have had. And I'm so excited to have you talk to us about it. So let's begin at the beginning. My experience of your book is that it's a love story. And first and foremost, it's a story about your love of music. As early as the prelude, you share with us your experience of attending a concert at 14 years old in 1960, where Leopold Stokowski was the maestro, the conductor, conducting members of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Can you talk a little bit about your experience at that concert? What made it so magical and the impact that it had on you?
There were so many different elements and considerations. The first thing is really interesting, and it's something that I haven't experienced a lot today. There are some classical music, or I should say, classical musicians who have that charisma. But it's downplayed a lot. We see popular music people who have this great presence, and movie stars, although fewer today than there used to be, I think, with that genuine kind of charisma.
Mm,
But with classical music, it's sort of, oh, they're really not supposed to have that because that's more in the entertainment field. And for a serious quote unquote conductor or musician to come on stage and attract attention for themselves and who they are, not just for the music. It's always been a little bit criticized. And my experience growing up in Philadelphia, Leopold Stokowski had left the Philadelphia Orchestra. I guess it was about 10 years before I really became aware of him and who he was. And the start of that was that my mother loved classical music,
mm.
and she had a very small collection of 78s
Oh, wow.
and some LPs, and that was way before CDs, way before, and certainly before streaming. And she played a lot of Stokowski's recordings, and I could tell that it was different. The music was more colorful, it was more riveting, it was far more emotional and expressive, and I really reacted to that, as I think many people did.
Mm,
I did remember seeing him in the movie Fantasia. I was 4 years old, And my mother, I don't know if it was both parents, but I was taken to see Fantasia. And I remember that moment that Stokowski, this great figure, very imposing, is on the podium, and Mickey Mouse walks over and tugs at his pants,
Mm,
and and Stokowski looks down and then leans over and shakes hands with Mickey Mouse. And it was quite adorable. Not many distinguished conductors, as I've said, would shake hands with a rodent, but
right.
Stokowski did. Would Toscanini have done that? No, no.
Mm,
There are very few conductors who would have. Maybe in later years, maybe Bernstein would have seen the wisdom
right,
in doing something, mixing classical music and pop culture.
right.
So I remembered that, and it was announced that Stokowski, for the first time in 19 years, would come back to Philadelphia to conduct the orchestra. Part of those
Mm,
concerts included, I think there were two or three at the Robin Hood Dell, which was the outdoor concert hall at that time of the Philadelphia Orchestra.
mm.
All you had to do to get in was clip a coupon from the two or three local papers, Inquirer, Bulletin, Daily News, and and you mailed that in, self-addressed, stamped envelope enclosed, and you got your tickets in return mail. And for some reason, my mother couldn't go with me. She might not have been well, but my next door neighbor, my older next door neighbor, went with me, and I'll be forever grateful because I was too young to go alone. I was 14. So there we were. This was a monumental event. It was quite historic,
Mm.
and 30,000 people showed up for that concert. And
Wow.
when we got there, and again, it was all general admission, for us. When we got there, there were already thousands of people waiting, trying to get in. And we had these tickets that we had clipped, that we had received. So we were able to go in. But once we got in, the ground, as well as the seats, the ground and the grassy, there was this grassy area to the right, and people had, people were just jammed all over the grass, and they had even some climbed into the trees to hear this concert. So, I mean, already you're talking about an atmosphere that was just crackling with excitement. And then Stokowski walked out on stage. I actually got a glimpse of him as he walked past the stage door. I was so thrilled. And then he came on stage, and of course this incredible presence, and he was quite handsome. He was 6'2", and he was wearing um, black tails, which not many conductors did at the outdoor concerts. And he had these beautiful hands, and he used them when it was appropriate, very poetically. Other times it was very intense or choppy or whatever the music needed. He knew how to get the music out of the orchestra. So that concert was also unforgettable for another reason. That a couple of minutes after he started to conduct, we heard woo woo, and it was a train. This train whistle blew way off in the distance, and he stopped the orchestra. Instead of just conducting, he stopped, and he stood there. I remember that ramrod straight, and he just stood there. Nobody breathed. You couldn't see any. He was just absolutely like a ramrod, and the orchestra sat there, and they stopped on a dime, so it was silent for about 4 minutes. It's a long
Oh,
time
wow.
for a concert to grind. It didn't grind to a halt; it stopped. And then he started conducting again, and a few minutes later, the train whistle blew again, and this time the audience kind of laughed. That was it. And he stormed off stage in the middle of the concert, and he went back, and they tried to talk him back on stage, and finally, after a little while, he did. He came back, and to wild applause, everybody was so happy and relieved that he was back. Uh, but he turned to the audience and he said something about we must be patient with modern technology, something like that, you know. So, and hearing somebody talk from the podium, conductors didn't do that. So it was all this incredible music
Mm.
and this great orchestra and all of these other things going on, you know. So of
Wow.
course at 14, that was it. So I guess let's see, 14. I think it was a year or two later, I was given a free ticket to
Right.
the Philadelphia Orchestra. I wish I don't know. I haven't really kept up on what orchestras are doing or schools. It's so important just to do nothing more than introduce kids to the concert hall and let them come in.
Yes.
And you never know what's going to stay with them. Uh, and I was given this ticket and I had to go back the next week. I was just compelled to go back. But of course, I didn't have a ticket. And it didn't occur to me really that I would need one. That obstacle was a little bit removed. So
Right.
I just got myself back to the concert hall, which was an hour away from our home in suburban Philadelphia. And when I got there, I went up to the box office. I said, I'd like a ticket. And she said, well, the cheapest seat we have is in the amphitheater, what they also called the peanut gallery, all the way up, $1.25. I was so stunned at this amount of money that I didn't say anything. I just stood there. And the woman in the box office remember, she had white hair. She was very gruff. And she said, oh, all right. She said, I hadn't said a word, but she said, oh, all right. She said, and she took out this little tiny pad of paper, and it was a printed form to get people into the concert hall. It would serve as a ticket. So she wrote out a seat number and signed her name and handed it to me. And I thanked her, and I went back week after week. And finally one day, and she had been very gruff, but this time she was quite sweet. And she said, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep giving you tickets. I'm going to get into trouble. She says, and she pointed in front of her. She says, go into the lobby. A lot of women buy 2 subscriptions. And as she said, the husbands don't come. So, so she says, maybe someone that would like to have your company for the concert. So I stood there, and I certainly wasn't dressed. These women were quite wealthy. These were the most expensive seats in the hall.
Oh,
And I stood there, and sure enough, some lovely person walked over and said, would you like to hear the concert? I said, yes. And they took me in. And that happened for a couple of weeks. And then that stopped working. So I thought, how can I get into that hall? What 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 other doors are there? And I remembered when I was walking from the Frankfurt elevated train that took me into Center City, that there was a door marked stage door. So I went around to the stage door and I just stood there for a couple of weeks. And those beautiful human beings in the orchestra, these were some of the greatest players in the world. No egos. They would, except for one person had an ego, but they would come over to me and talk. And what are you doing here? And I'd ask them questions. They were lovely people. And finally, one day, Eugene Ormandy, who was now the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, walked by, and he stopped and he said, who are you? He says, I see you here every week. All I said was, I love the orchestra. And he said, do you have a ticket? And I said, no. And he said, come with me. And he took me to his office backstage. And the funny part of it was that he called the box office and he said, I'm sending a friend of mine, please give her a ticket. And I showed up, and this wonderful woman whose name was Catherine Haley, um, whom everybody called Mom Haley. But when she saw that I was walking toward the box office. She says, you couldn't afford a ticket. Now you're Eugene Ormandy's friend. It's like a movie, you know?
Yeah.
So that was really the beginning of learning the backstage layout, where I knew if I could get in through the stage door, I could then bypass the ticket takers. So I was there all the time.
Wow. And you describe wandering down the different hallways and, exploring, no
Yeah.
fear. And then one day you opened a door and started to come into a room. Tell us about that. Because
Oh
that was
yeah.
a very monumental moment in what
Yeah.
was to follow.
Yeah, that was huge. The backstage area was fascinating because it was a building. Academy of Music was built in 1857, the Civil War era, and
Mm,
they had all these rooms. One had was just jammed with opera props, and others they just had all kinds of wonderful things. And then there was one doorway, and they were all green metal doors, and it wasn't marked with anything. So I opened it. I thought it'd be interesting to see what was inside. I opened it, and there were two men sitting there, and I had always said hello to them. One was the librarian, and the other was the assistant conductor. And when I opened that door, there they were sitting at this long linoleum table working. And I got scared, so I started to close the door. And the librarian said, "You may come in. You may come in." So I reopened the door and I went in, and he said, "This is the library. This is where we prepare the music for the orchestra."
mm,
And I didn't understand what that meant because I knew music. I had taken cello lessons, so I knew music was printed, but what would they have to do? Why would they have to alter or do anything different to the music that was sitting in front of the orchestra
right.
players? And he started to explain all of that to me. And I was so fascinated that I came back. I think it was probably the next day or a few days later. And and first time he said, "Pull up a chair. I'll show you what I'm doing."
Mm,
And that was the beginning of a 2-year apprenticeship. I mean, I didn't know that's what it would turn out to be, but
right.
I was just fascinated with what they were doing.
So,
I had also sort of found a surrogate family.
yeah.
That here were these 100 members of the orchestra who were just lovely people.
Mm,
And further into the relationship, they really protected me. They took it on themselves to teach me and talk to me and share things, and it was quite a beautiful experience. So after 2 years of going to the library, one day I said to the librarian, I said, "How are you?" And he said, "Not so good." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, my assistant left unexpectedly." I said, "Here I am." And he laughed. At first he thought it was a joke, so he kind of, I think he mussed my hair up. "Yeah, if we need you, we'll call you." And the next day I was in my room at home, and my mother knocked on my door, and she said, "Mr. Tainton is on the phone from the Philadelphia Orchestra." So I went into my father's room, his office, and I picked up the receiver. I'll never forget it because not only was he on the phone, but I could hear the orchestra playing in the background.
mm.
He had called me during rehearsal.
And he
It was
offered you the
amazing.
job. He offered you the
He
job, right?
said, he said, "If you want a job, get back here."
Wow.
That's what he said.
Wow. So I want to have you talk a little bit about that job because I have been fortunate. I have been to see I live in New Hampshire. I grew up outside of Boston, the Boston Symphony Orchestra. My parents who are older, are still season ticket holders. And so I have a pretty good idea of what the experience is like, but I have to tell you, after reading about the job that you did, which I'll have you talk about, it gave me such a greater appreciation for what is actually involved, especially with the conductor. Because, so tell us, what does a orchestra librarian do? We think of librarians as books, but it's a very special job and it relates to the conductor. Can you explain that
Yeah, I
for
wish
us?
they had a different name for it because orchestra librarian, I wish it were like orchestra preparation something
Yeah,
or other. But librarian, it's really not at all. There are no books involved.
right,
The librarian starts where, in a way, where the publisher leaves off. Composer composes every note that every member of that orchestra will play. That's what the composer does. Nothing is left to anybody's imagination or opinion. They notate exactly what they would like. But every conductor who stands in front of that orchestra wants a different type of interpretation. They're different people. I mean, thank goodness, because
right,
then every performance we hear would be the same, but it's all these variables. So the librarian will work with the conductor, and sometimes you don't even see each other, but they would mail their scores. They put their scores in the mail or have them delivered. And in their scores, they made certain additional markings. And the most prominent, the most familiar that people will be able to relate to immediately are the bows
right.
of all the string instruments. And most conductors like all the bows going in the same direction. So you see it's always
Right.
very much coordinated bowing. And and there are other markings for expression and phrasing. You'll see certain arches that are penciled in over groups of notes that will give a musician idea of how to phrase. And that's all put in by the librarians. There are also rehearsal numbers and letters. And most of the time, the publisher will put that into the music, but there's very often there aren't enough of them. So let's say conductor's conducting in a rehearsal and he or she has to stop, wants to correct something, wants to make sure the musicians have the right note, whatever it is, they have to stop during a rehearsal. Well, when they're ready to start again, you want to have a lot of different places so that you don't have to count back, oh, 23 measures before letter R. You don't want to waste time by counting.
Right.
So the more letters and numbers there are clearly marked in those orchestra parts, the better. And then the conductor can just say, letter P, boom, and they
Right.
bring down the baton or their hand, and everybody starts at the same place.
Mm. Wow.
So that's some of the things. There's also very basic repairing of very old music because paper will
Mhm.
disintegrate
Right.
and you have to repair it, especially with orchestras and string players where two share a music stand. With the wind players, they're all playing from different parts. Each of them has their own stand and their own music. But with the string players, it's two to a stand with one set of parts on the stand. And in the heat of the music, one of them will quickly turn the page. Well, sometimes if it's old music, that page is going to rip. Or they'll slap it down with their bow. One is continuing to play and the other turns it and has to flatten it out, and that's where they'll hit it with the bow. And the music takes a little bit of loving abuse. That's part of being an orchestra part.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's all in there, but these interpretive markings are very important from conductor to conductor to conductor.
Yes.
Very few conductors can use the parts and the markings from another conductor.
And
Very
it's a huge responsibility on the part of the orchestra librarian because you were responsible for ensuring the accuracy of the markings as they go from conductor to the scores going to you, and then also getting them, distributing them on the stands. You would bring them out to the stands of the orchestra. So, and the markings directly and significantly impact the music. And so
Absolutely.
the smallest error or oversight can have a huge effect, right?
Yeah, once in a while, and I've been away from this profession for a long time. Once in a while, I'll have an orchestra library nightmare. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
seriously, I'll awaken out of a deep sleep and I'll say, "Oh my God, you put the piccolo part on the first violin stand."
Yeah,
But there were a lot of very near disasters. And I know from being in the business a long time, hearing stories about some orchestra librarians where things would just get mixed up, and it could be a disaster if it you do iron things out at the rehearsals, but parts parts have a way of getting lost,
yes.
and it's almost like they have little legs or something, and they'll walk away. I mean, one minute they're there, and the next minute they're not there. And
Yeah,
the musicians go through their briefcases and their instrument cases and try to find. And if it's a string part, most of the time you have duplicates, and there are duplicates within that section. But if you lose a wind part or a percussion part, you cannot go on with the performance. You can't.
right.
So it's pretty heavy responsibility.
Yeah, you've got to have some courage to be able to step up and be willing to do that job, would you say? Take something.
I'm
What
not
would you
sure.
call it? What would
This
you
whole
call it?
this whole issue about a dedication, I would call
Okay.
it real love and dedication.
Okay.
Whole issue of courage is so interesting, about fear and courage
Mm.
and doing certain things where there's a little bit of risk involved. It's absolutely fascinating, but you really have to be dedicated and want to make things as good as they can be for the performances.
Yes.
I remember, and I was only 17 when I was hired by the orchestra. I was really very young, and I remember at one point the conductor wanted something changed. And I think there were just two measures involved. It's what, about 30, maybe 30 seconds, and I didn't know. So I said to my boss at that point, Jesse. His name was Jesse Tainton, and I said, why can't the conductor just announce that? I said it would just take, 30 seconds or so. And he so sweetly and kindly explained to me, he said, rehearsal time is very precious. There's limited time. We have just a certain amount of rehearsal, and that's it. So he said, it's very precious, and you don't want to waste that. It's also expensive because you're paying 100 people, it's union, and it's a lot of money. But the main issue was, you don't want to waste precious rehearsal time. That should be spent on making the performance as wonderful and
Mm.
excellent as it can be.
Mm.
Yeah.
So another part of the love story in your book is your adoration. I think you use that word more than once in some form or fashion in the book of Leopold Stokowski.
Yeah.
Um, what was it about him that caused you to put him on a pedestal? I think you explained some of it already with respect to being 4 years old and seeing him in Fantasia. As you got to know him better, how did that change? Like that pedestal and that adoration? And how were you able to reconcile your adoration of, you refer to him as like a god to in your perception, with your experience of the man?
Yeah, just to fill everybody in, that after I'd been working with the orchestra for about a year, and Stokowski was coming back regularly to Philadelphia, and I started to write to him. I just thought I just thought he would be really interested in what I thought about the world. And, I mean, a kid, young people, they think this. So I got his address and I'd write to him about, and every letter was answered so thoughtfully with his beautiful, unique, sprawling signature that went halfway across the
Mm.
page. He was bigger than life, you know. So and then we would talk. I would go. I waited for him at the stage door for one of his rehearsals, and I didn't know that this rehearsal was what they call closed, which meant not only no visitors, nobody from the press, but no family members of the orchestra players and no members of the staff of the orchestra.
Wow.
Nobody. So at this point, I had been working with the librarian, but I said I just want to hear Stokowski's rehearsal. And he said, no, he says, I don't think that's going to happen because nobody is allowed in. Nobody. Uh, so I decided I was going to give it a try. So I waited outside the stage door. It was freezing cold February day. And sure enough, his car pulled up and he, very again imposing figure. He had on this, I remember, a long black overcoat and a white silk scarf at
Mm.
his neck, which picked up the white of his hair. Quite a vision. And I waited for him, and he started quickly to walk into the stage door, and I ran after him, maestro, maestro, and he turned around and I said, "May I attend your rehearsal?" And he motioned with his hand like this to go into the stage door ahead of him. And when we got in there, he bent down because he was so much taller than I. He bent down and he said, "Why do you want to hear the rehearsal?" And with my incredible memory, which is like a video camera, I have never been able to remember what I said to him, but I do remember that he put his head back and he laughed, and that was not something that Stokowski did often. And then he said he had his hand on right on the back of my shoulder, and he said, "I will allow you to come to this rehearsal on one condition." And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "That you come backstage after the rehearsal and tell me your impressions." I took this so seriously, Barbara. I mean, I thought this was really important to him. So I attended the most remarkable rehearsal. And at the end of that, I remember he did the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, which, ends with this timpani going at it and, it's in a blaze of glory. And I ran backstage, and he was using Eugene Ormandy's dressing room, which Ormandy allowed him to do just as a courtesy for the former music director. And I remember sitting in Ormandy's office chair that swiveled, and I was sitting in there. And Stokowski said, in fact, he didn't say anything. He held up his finger, one, meaning I will be right back. And he went into the bathroom, and I heard him just getting washed. And he came out, and I stopped. I was spinning around in the chair. I remember I stopped. I was so young. And he said, "What did you think?" And I thanked him, and I talked about a little bit about the music. But there was something he did that I didn't understand, that after the symphony begins, I forget exactly what section it was, but he slowed the orchestra down. And I hadn't heard it that way on records. So I didn't know why he did that. So I asked him, I said, "You slowed the orchestra down." And he opened his score and he pointed to that section and he explained a little bit about why he slowed them down. And then that was it. He gave me enough time. I was dismissed out. So we spent a lot of time ta- talking when he came back to conduct the orchestra. So about a year after I was hired by the orchestra, he would ask me to sit with him backstage. He always meditated, but there are occasions where he'd say, come in, you know. He would just gesture more than he'd talk, and I'd sit. Didn't talk, but I would sit with him while he meditated. And this once during intermission at the Robin Hood, the door, his dressing room door was open, and you could hear the sounds of this enormous crowd talking. And I thought he would prefer having quiet, so I started to close it. And he said, "No, no, leave that open." He loved hearing that sound.
Mm.
And while we were sitting there, he turned to me and he said, "Would you consider coming to New York part time to work with me on my library?" He said, "I want to redo the library, and I guess conduct great orchestras, certainly like Boston Symphony, and dream come true." You're talking about almost a fantasy coming true.
Wow.
So there were many years I would go to his place early in the morning from Philadelphia and work with him on his library.
Mm.
So, um, so you asked what really attracted me to him. It's
Yeah.
so hard to know why people are attracted to each other, but he was such this godlike presence, and he made such spectacular music, and I loved what he did with the music.
Yeah.
Somebody else may not have loved it, but I did. And so the musical relationship, the professional relationship, really was always combined with a personal relationship, and he loved to talk to me, and he was always interested in what young people had to say, what they were thinking and what they were feeling. And in his days as music director, he did a very, very famous series of concerts that he conducted. They were children's concerts. He didn't give them to an assistant conductor, which most people do.
Mm.
He conducted them, and they were legendary in their imagination and the fun and the repertoire. He gave the United States premiere of the Shostakovich Piano Concerto No. 1 for the kids, not for
Wow.
the adult audience, for the children. And I said to him one day, I said, "Well, why do you play such incredible music for young people?" And he said, "Because he said, young people have no prejudice in their listening." He said, "They listen to the music. Adults are very prejudiced." And of course, he was right. So all of this just contributed to our becoming closer and closer. And then in 1972, he was 90 years old, very youthful, energetic, alive 90-year-old. And he moved to England, which at first for me was just a horror because I
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to get to see him as much. But then he'd say, "Come and stay here," you know. So I would go, and that was incredible because I would spend a week, 8 days, 10 days staying with him at his home, and and all you do is we ate together and did a lot of talking and a lot of listening to music, and that was really incredible. So
Yeah. Especially where he did have a bit of a reputation. He had been
oh,
married several times, I think, and had
3 times.
affairs and Greta Garbo, I want to say. And
Oh, he spent more than a year with Garbo. She
yeah,
really wanted to marry him. No, I'm
yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry. I reversed it. He wanted to marry her, but she didn't want to marry. She
Oh,
didn't want to get married, which she never did. Yeah.
so
He had a
you're,
terrible reputation.
and so,
Womanizer.
yeah, so your relationship, which was not that, could have gone a very different way. And why, what was
Yeah.
it about the relationship that you had? I think you've already explained some of it, but how it my sense in reading the story is that you both loved each other deeply, but in a way that was not necessarily romantic.
It did become romantic
I when
at
he
the
was
end.
90, what, 92?
He was up there, yeah, but it was a very beautiful relationship. But
Yes.
for some reason, I don't know. I trusted him,
Yeah.
and he lived up to that trust.
Yes.
He
Yes.
did.
Which is really
And there's
beautiful.
one very cute story in the book. The book is really stories,
Yes.
and I was at his place in New York, and there were times where I would go all the way back to Philadelphia and in the evening, and then I'd come all the way back, get up at 5:30 in the morning the next day, and I'm thinking like, why? And I passionately loved New York, so I wanted to stay in the city, in which I don't think I had ever slept one night in New York. So uh, I there were like two rooms. His study, where he had this long desk and a fluorescent light above it, so it would kind of illuminate his hair and his magnificent profile,
Mm.
and the other was his secretary's room. So I remember standing under an arch that separated the rooms, and I said to him, "This doesn't make sense. I go all the way back to Philadelphia, and then I come all the way back here." I said, "This doesn't make sense." So suddenly there was this little smile, and he said, "Oh, so you want to stay here?" So I said, "Well, it would make sense, wouldn't it?" And that again, that little smile, and then the smile disappeared. And he looked at me and he said, "No." He said, "You go home to your family."
Yeah.
Done. So
Mm.
it was I was being protected.
Yes.
I was
Yes.
protected by him. But
Yes.
when he got older, I was 31 when he died. I was a grown woman. I was a
Mm.
grown woman. I could make
Mm.
decisions for myself, and the
And you
relationship
did. And you did.
changed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So there is a theme in my perception in your book about uncertainty. You do talk about your parents. They had a challenged relationship. Your mom had health challenges um and there was uncertainty about what you would be happening, what you would find there when you went home on any given day. Um And there was uncertainty about where you were going to get your next ticket to see the orchestra. There was uncertainty about where that was going to take you and whether you would, there was just all this uncertainty, but you let it unfold in a way to just see what happened. Um, which I call a superpower. You seem to have the superpower about coping with uncertainty. We talked about courage or mentioned courage. You didn't run away from it. You leaned into it. You didn't know, even it's like thinking, visioning you walking through those hallways, opening those doors, you know, you didn't know what was there. It's very metaphoric for the whole concept of uncertainty.
yeah.
What will I find here? And yet there you are exploring. So where did that come from? Where do you attribute
I
that?
I would love to back up a little bit because I
Sure.
want I want everybody out there. I don't want to hide anything about my family. My mother was either mentally or emotionally disturbed,
Okay.
and she suffered from depression and anxiety, but to the nth degree. It was very, very serious.
Mm.
And of course, I was an only child, so it affected every second of my life. Probably still does. My father was very violent, not physically as much as verbally, but there was a lot of verbal abuse and fighting, and it was just a terrible way to grow up.
Yes.
So that's really what was going on. Um, the music probably served as a bit of a sanctuary where I could go and, hey, when I knew when I walked into that through that stage door, I was in a perfect world.
Yeah.
It was perfect. I had this
Mm.
incredible music, and and this can't really be underestimated that or overestimated that there were 100 men in the Philadelphia Orchestra. There were four women, um, two of whom were harpists. The other one was a violinist, and the other was my cello teacher, Elsa Hilder, who was a
Yeah.
groundbreaker, first woman in any major symphony orchestra. 1935, Stokowski put her in the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I had 100 men that I was with on a daily basis,
Mm.
and there was nothing about it that referred to the Me Too movement. These 100 people actually protected me. It was quite beautiful, and I am forever grateful. And that's why the book, if you look at the dedication page, is dedicated to
Mm.
Leopold Stokowski and the men and women of the Philadelphia Orchestra then and now, because
Yeah.
they are still making such incredible music.
Mm.
So yeah, it's but when you talk about courage, I think that what I was terrified of was leading a boring life.
Mm.
And I think I was willing to accept other risky situations only because it was more interesting.
Yeah.
And I just thought about the very next step. But of course, part of that was moving to New York City in 1980. It's a tough city. Nobody loves it more
Yes.
than I do. It's a tough town. And there were times where I got scared. I didn't know if I was going to have enough to eat or not. But
Mm.
there are some risks that you accept because the rewards are greater than what you're paying.
Yes. Yes. So, what made you decide to write the book? And maybe you can tell us too where you came up with the idea for the title.
I had to write this book, and I've been writing since I was a small child. I just kept writing, but when when I started to work at Curtis Institute, a wonderful conductor by the name of Paul Paré, Frenchman, just a lovely person, and one day, and I was in charge of the rehearsals. And one day, I started taking notes about some things that he said and things that had happened during the rehearsal. And I brought my camera, so I took pictures. And then I was in Vienna, and the the editor of Musical America magazine, which was the high fidelity Musical America, huge, biggest one I think in the world, was there, and we were talking, and I said, "Would you be interested in an article about Paul Paret?" And she said, "Absolutely." He was a historic figure. He did a lot of French world premieres of standard repertoire. Amazing. And so I wrote up the article, and it was published 1978. So writing has been always very important to me. I had to work at other things because I had to earn a living, and writing is not the most secure work in the
Right?
world. So as time went on, I was thinking about the story about the Philadelphia Orchestra and orchestra librarian work and Stokowski and just making music and the whole backstage process, which I find to this day a miracle. It's a
Mm.
miracle. Huh? You get everybody together on the same stage, and everybody agrees that they're going to agree. They agree to agree that all the different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, political
Mm.
differences, and yet they come together for 2 hours and they decide we're going to leave all of that. We're going to make music together.
Mm.
I find it astonishing. So I wanted to share all of this. I did, you know, it's a lot of this information other people don't know, and it's rare. Um, I also started so young that I am probably the last person now to write first person about that era
Mm.
and what I experienced. So I felt it was not only a joy that I wanted to do it, but it's a bit of a
Mhm.
responsibility to to keep that legacy going. So what better way to share it than to write a book?
Yeah. It's a fabulous gift that you've given everybody to have the opportunity to read these stories. And
Thank
the
you.
title. Tell us about the title.
A friend of mine asked me what the book was about because all my long-suffering friends, they knew. I remember I said to my friend Charlotte, I said something about, I'm writing a book, and she so sweetly looked at me and says, "Yes, Nan, we know you're writing a book." It was like, I don't want to hear about it anymore. Uh, but somebody said, "What's it about?" So I said, I started in music when I was so young. I said, I even knew a man who knew Brahms. And
Yes.
suddenly I thought, there's kind of a nice rhythm to it, and it's a little bit intriguing. I didn't want a title that did not reflect music because I didn't want people to buy the book and say, wait a minute, I didn't know this was not completely, but heavily about music. So when my agent talked to me about the book, I said, what about the title? My original title was actually different. I may use it for another book, but I said, do you like this title? And she said, it's the last thing you have to think about because publishers will usually change the title. Whatever you have as a working title, they'll usually last thing they do is they'll change it. So I thought, fine, as long as it gets published. And then I got the contract for the book. And in the contract, that was the title. I knew a man who knew Brahms.
Mhm.
So some people, it's interesting. Some people have said, one reviewer, the book has gotten really good reviews, but one reviewer said the book derives its title from an inconsequential event, meaning that it was something small that had happened, and it didn't warrant a lot of discussion in the book. But I wanted to say to this reviewer, when you're 18 years old and a very old person, walks into the room where you're working and somebody says, shake that man's hand, and you're holding his hand, and you're told you are now shaking the hand that shook the hand of Johannes Brahms, it's not inconsequential.
No.
It changes who you are, it changes your life. So I'm very happy to have that title.
Fabulous. Fabulous. So I feel I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, it's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Well, tell us why and how she
Oh,
has influenced you.
I wish young people today had real heroes. I don't know who their heroes are. I'm not close. I don't have children or grandchildren. I don't have nieces or nephews. I wish I knew more young people. So if any young people hear this, contact me, email me, because I'd love to get to know the younger generation. But I was 7 or 8 years old, and I remember sitting on the floor watching. It was probably Sunday morning, the commentary and the political programs, and I remembered seeing this beautiful older woman who had such strength, quiet strength, and dignity and seriousness, but also sweetness. And I listened to the interview, and it was the former First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. That was the beginning of literally a lifetime to this day of learning about her and her horrible childhood, which I didn't know about the first time. I was just amazed by her presence. But what she had done for this country, there was no ego, there was nothing self serving. She wanted to help her beloved country, and many times she went publicly against the wishes of Franklin D. Roosevelt, her husband, who gave her that kind of freedom, but she probably would have taken it anyway. It was not disrespect on her part. She knew what she would have to do.
Yes.
The internment of the Japanese during the Second World War, she fought very loudly to have that stopped, and she actually went to California to the camps
Hmm.
and talked to these people and gave them a much higher public persona and profile. So with Black people, with Jewish people, with women,
Yeah.
she held the first press conferences only for women reporters because she knew that would force newspapers and broadcast media to hire women because she wouldn't allow men into her press conferences. She's great, great human being. So, um, but it was basically her fight against fear and her attitude about being courageous, whatever it took, that really has given me courage on a daily basis
Mm.
all these years. She serves the same role in my life, perhaps that a religious leader would serve for other people. But
Wow.
she has been my spiritual leader, mother figure, whatever, uh, for my whole life. I'm not completely sure I would have survived without her example
Wow.
and her writing. Um, just the example of how she chose to live with tremendous courage. It's a great story. I wish that more young people could become familiar with who she was and what she did.
Yes. And just knowing her story, and the power of how we are inspired and influenced by that goes to the power of sharing our stories in general, that we can learn from one another, we can grow from one another, and that's very, very powerful and important because as human beings, isn't that what we're kind of hardwired to do? We've kind of gotten away from it because of our culture and but in terms of I think our biology, that's what we're meant to do for each other. Do you
Well,
think?
you just said that really beautifully.
Thank
You
you.
did, and you're absolutely right. And I wish more people felt that strongly about it. But
Yeah.
yeah, we're here to teach each other and help each other. Yeah, we're our brothers and sisters keepers.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'd like to think there are a lot of people that feel that way. They just don't get as much airtime as everything else, but they're out there. They're
And
out there for sure.
by the way, if my memory is correct, I think Eleanor Roosevelt recorded Peter and the Wolf with Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony.
Oh, wow. I'll
I
have to go
think. I'm
looking
not
for that.
completely sure, but check it out.
I will. I will. So, what is it that you hope that people will get from your book and your stories?
Most of all, it really is the music. Uh, it's such a magnificent part, or can be such a magnificent part of our lives.
Yes.
And the only thing is, in our day and age, that you have to pay attention to get out of it everything that you can, the maximum. You can't be on your phone and texting somebody and watching the news and reading the paper. You have to sit there and listen to the music. I personally can't listen to it as background music. Very little that I can. So I'm hoping it'll bring people closer to the music so that they can
Mm.
listen differently. And most of all, I just want people, everybody, to have permission to come into the concert hall. You don't need a degree in music. You don't need any prior experience or knowledge. But, and I've said this before, and I'll say it many times, that you get a ticket somehow, you get into that concert hall one way or another,
Yes.
and you belong there just as much as a music critic or a professional musician. You belong there. And anybody who tells you otherwise is blatantly wrong.
Mm.
Anybody who says, oh, well, you have to dress a certain way or behave a certain way, or you have to come with a pre existing knowledge, you don't.
Mm.
You don't. You just sit there and pay attention
Yeah.
and listen. And if there's something you don't like, that's legitimate. Not
Right.
all of us like everything.
Right.
So, I said I hope it's a literary welcome mat into this world. So, and everybody,
Mm,
come on
I
in.
love that. Yes, I love
Yeah.
that.
So that's really what I hope the book will do. And then also to give young people who perhaps are having difficulty at home to let them realize it doesn't have to ruin your life.
Oh,
And if you don't have, if your family doesn't have a lot of money, it doesn't mean that you're going to do without the important things. I have for many years, been very grateful that my parents didn't have a lot of money because if they did, I probably would have been able to buy a ticket and go in through the front door and
that's
hand it to
right.
the usher and sit in my seat. But I had to find a way of getting in there because I couldn't. I didn't have the money.
Right.
Um, so I guess it's really don't be discouraged. Don't be
Mm,
discouraged.
I
Just
love that.
fight, fight for what you are and what you want in a loving way, and go for it.
Speaking of going for it, where do we go to
Hey,
get this book? I knew a man who knew Brahms. What's the best way to get our hands on it?
anywhere where you can get books,
Okay.
anywhere. I know Barnes and Noble has it, Amazon has it, but local bookstores. There are people who love um, buying books from the independent
Yeah.
bookstores there. So I would hope, and it's in four formats. I recorded the audiobook, and that's available streamed and as a set of CD. It's one CD. It's all on one CD. It's
Oh,
12 hours, and hardcover and ebook. So
oh,
it's
that's
out
so
there.
good to know because, and you recorded it yourself. You're the narrator?
I did, yeah.
Oh, fabulous. Because I love hearing you talk.
It was a
And
lot of fun.
oh, I
It was.
bet I'll have to check that out too. Thank you so very much for being here. What a pleasure, what an
Thank you.
honor. Oh,
This was an absolute delight, especially with your insightful, wonderful questions.
oh, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And I look forward to your next book and just more of whatever it is you bring to the world because I know it'll be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care and be well.
You as well.
Thank you.